Hi, normal dialogue. Hi, thoughts. Hi, elvish dialogue. Book 1 Philosopher's Stone Chapter 1 The Letter of Help. Wendy simply wasn't understanding what was happening right now. Her brother, the man she honestly respected more than anyone in her whole family, not that there were many people worthy of respect to begin with if she was being completely honest, in fact, she could easily count them on the fingers of one hand and still have 4 fingers left over. What was she saying? Oh yes, she didn't understand why her brother was looking practically defeated right now. Everything all right, Annie? He finally asked as he took the letter her brother was reading from his hands and forced him to look directly into his eyes, both sets of ruby-bright orbs looking at each other with a range of complex emotions. In him there was uncertainty and a little bit of worry, in her there was worry and genuine interest in his well-being. It's complicated, little one, Naruto told his younger sister as he let out a deep sigh of exasperation. Cousin Artoria, she sent me a letter. Well, it's a really complicated situation. Wendy simply had to blink. Artoria, the fabulous cousin Artoria, was one of the few relatives that Naruto genuinely appreciated and for whom he would truly fight the whole world, so he turned to the letter he had left on his desk and although he didn't read it, he could make out his older cousin's elegant handwriting, as well as the lack of the official Pendragon house seal, which made it more than clear that whatever she had asked for wasn't an official order but a genuine request that he could refuse but was finding difficult to refuse. Does she want you to sign the engagement contract with Mo-chan? He asked with a slightly teasing tone, causing a violent thunder to roar outside the residence, which possibly muffled the aforementioned roar. If so, I don't know why you keep refusing. I mean, you both sleep together, and we both know you don't sleep alone. Has she sent marriage proposals to her? The older brother genuinely asked. He had no idea about that. Laughing a little nervously, Wendy finally spoke again. It's complicated. She wasn't going to tell him that her mother had rejected them all, something about not losing control even if it was weak control she had over Naruto. What did she ask for then? Naruto knew she was hiding something, but he didn't see the need to investigate it. He would ask later. Naruto's eyes flickered for a few seconds, not quite sure how to start the conversation. She's going to do an educational reform and, he simply stopped at that moment, not sure how to continue. Wendy simply tilted her head gently in confusion for a few seconds, a little confused about the whole educational reform thing. Her cousin had never really tried to do a new educational reform or anything like that. On the other hand, her brother always told her that there was something called a chain of priorities and that education, although a big problem in Great Britain, there were a few more pressing things before. He never told her what those priorities were. She was too young to understand them, so they always kept her on the sidelines, at least until recently when they started to tell her more things, saying you're 12 years old, oh well, you'll turn 12 on October 10th, it's time you start entering the adult world. What's the new reform like? Has she asked you for help with it? She finally asked after a while of remaining silent to think about things. If that was the case, then she could also help. She was much more theoretical than her brother, and even if Great Britain was a completely horrible place to live, she preferred it to being with her mother, listening to her belittle her brother every day, dealing with her emotional blackmail and other frankly things were taking their toll. She doubted Delta would last much longer. They were running out of targets she could destroy to keep her away from the neck of the most powerful woman, politically speaking, in the magical world. Some of them, and yes, she has asked for my help, said the older brother with a sigh. She wants me to give history of magic classes. Apparently the damn ghost who used to give the class has finally been exorcised, and according to her, I'm the most suitable to give the class, but she wants to meet me for something more important, Naruto said with a small smile, making Wendy look at him genuinely confused. Does she think it's a good idea? You know, she was actually worried about her brother's condition. I can have an assistant in case I can't stay awake, Naruto said with a small smile on his face. He actually had a vague idea of who that assistant might be. He didn't have an elite assassination squad just because, well, mostly it was to tell his mother fuck off, having almost a dozen perfectly tuned killing machines capable of taking on a whole country in a day, or the whole world in a month, a week if he intervened in the matter. What was the point he was trying to make? Meh, it didn't matter right now. Wendy looked at her older brother with genuine curiosity on her face, wondering what the hell he was thinking right now. In the end she simply shrugged. She supposed she would tell him eventually. She still had a few more questions to ask him, but before she could ask them, Naruto spoke again. You have many questions, but she also wrote to you. She did. The redhead asked, less completely confused. She didn't know why she would have done it. She was a mage, support sorcerers, not to mention she wasn't old enough to be a teacher. Her brother was barely 15 and he only did it because of his brain's ability to process information at inhuman speeds, but she was still in her first year of secondary education. In response, the redhead simply handed his younger sister the letter that was sent to his sister. Wendy looked at it for a few seconds. It had the Hogwarts symbol, which only implied one thing, one that she really hoped wasn't true, but in the end she simply broke the seal and took out the old parchment that, oh my god, was going to start a revolution with notebooks. It was much easier to take notes with them. Can I borrow 1,000 galleons? Wendy asked, making Naruto look at her with one raised eyebrow for a few seconds. Okay, I'll investigate the English economy first before I start a cultural revolution. Happy? He simply nodded. His family was incredibly rich, but his mother didn't allow him full access to his fortune, and although they had a lot, they had to carefully guard every piece of gold, silver, or bronze they spent, although considering the current state of the English vault and his mother's relationship with Arthur, if possible. Wendy knew that her older brother was thinking about something, so she simply started reading her letter, which, to her slight frustration, was written in English and not Elvish. At least she had a good level of English. Dear Miss Uzumaki Wendy, I, Arteria Pendragon 15, am pleased to inform you that you have been chosen to be the first foreign student to be admitted to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry as part of the new initiative to improve basic magical education in the United Kingdom and Ireland. Attached to this letter you will find a list of all the necessary books and equipment. The period begins on September 1st. I expect your letter of confirmation before August 31st. Sincerely, Arteria Pendragon 15. Artie has to learn to write letters. Wendy commented in English, getting her older brother's attention. They rarely spoke in English between them. Is this what worries you any? She asked, switching back to Elvish. In a way, but honestly it was obvious that she wasn't going to separate us. What worries me is the money. Hogwarts is an elite school and its tuition fees are quite high. Again, money was a genuine concern for him. They wouldn't be poor Weasleys but the life they were used to, a residence, because he didn't want to live in Camelot Palace, but maybe, just maybe, if he gained control of the English vault, he wasn't sure how to deal with that, but maybe if he talked to the goblins, he could get total control without his mother interfering. Wendy simply gave him a small encouraging smile. He could manage his economic situation easily. For now she simply started reading the list of materials. First-year students will require uniform, 3 sets of simple work tunics, black. This made her grimace slightly. She didn't like tunics, they were incredibly cumbersome. Well, as long as she could wear trousers, everything would be fine. A simple pointed hat, black, to wear during the day. She hoped it was optional. The idea of wearing a pointed hat really made her sense of fashion and good taste scream. A pair of protective gloves, dragon skin or similar. This made her blink. They didn't make dragon skin gloves, at least not for anyone outside the army. Well, her brother could make her some, or she could simply ask her favorite sister-in-law for a piece of her shed skin and get one of her tailors to make one. A winter cloak, black silver clasps. They didn't know warming spells. Please note that all student clothing must have name tags at all times. What were they, stupid enough not to be able to identify their damn uniforms? Books, Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1, by Miranda Goshawk. Oh, they used a primary school book for the first year, yay. A History of Magic, by Bathilda Bagshot. Oh, and a biased book to make the English look more important than they really were worldwide, by an author who is discredited and ridiculed worldwide, W.A. Magic Theory by Adelbert Waffing. Ah, that one was good, but again it was a primary school book. Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration, by Emmerich Switch. Weren't they supposed to have discredited his work at the beginning of the last decade? 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi by Philida Spore. She was having a very serious conversation with her cousin about the list of books. That book didn't have a reaction table, or annotations on how to store them correctly, or, it was just a book that listed the ingredients and some of the potions they were used in, not their individual effects, not where to find them, not the correct way to handle them. Potions and Magical Brews by Arsenius Jigger. She was starting to think that the headmaster or the board was full of idiots. This book was so outdated it wasn't even funny. Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, by Newt Scamander. Oh thank goodness, a decent one, and curiously by one of the few men in the world whom her brother genuinely respected, although she didn't know why they were using his first book and not the latest edition. Oh well, surely it was to start with the basic animals and they would use the latest edition to know how and why they shouldn't approach ancestral creatures, or cataclysmic creatures. The Dark Arts, a Self-Protection Guide by Quentin Trimble. She had never heard of that guy. Oh well, 1 out of 8 was more than she thought it would be. Other equipment. 1 wand. She had to use one. She really didn't like those things, they broke easily. 1 cauldron, standard size 2, they wanted children with no prior knowledge of a dangerous subject to have accidents, those things melted if you breathed too close to them. 1 set of glass or crystal jars. How many jars made up a set? 1 telescope. That they didn't have an observatory. What kind of respectable magic school didn't have an observatory? Or at least a planetarium. 1 set of brass scales. They didn't know graduated scales or even digital ones. Students can also bring an owl. If she wasn't allergic to feathers, a cat. Humph, Biako counted as a cat, she hoped so because she was going to take him whether he liked it or not. Or a toad. That was a big no. Parents are reminded that first-year children cannot have their own brooms. Wendy finally blinked a couple of times before reading the letter again before looking at her older brother again. Annie, the materials list has to be wrong, right? There's no way this is the real list. Wendy said as she showed the list to her older brother, who simply raised an eyebrow as he read the materials in question. I'm afraid not. All this is standard material at Hogwarts. I'm sure it's part of the reason why Artoria wants me to teach the history of magic class. I guess I'll have to see how screwed up that subject is in particular, said the older brother with a sigh, already making a mental face at the amount of work this would entail. "Hey boss, the emo and the whitey came to see you, we let them in." His thoughts were soon interrupted when one of his perfectly trained killing machines suddenly entered the room, in the most scandalous way possible, that is, by throwing the door open. "Define emo and whitey," Naruto asked as he looked at the girl in question, easily recognizable by her excited violet eyes and her perpetually happy ponytail moving a mile a second. As for her request to define emo and whitey, well, the number of emo and whitey duets was surprisingly high. "Bangs and bright eyes," said the beast girl with a smile, proud of having remembered that detail. Naruto simply had to sigh. That narrowed down the options quite a bit, but didn't leave a specific duet. "Grade?" asked the redhead, knowing this was the easiest question, or at least the one that would rule out the most duets. "It's Satoru-san and his emo friend." Naruto actually had to hold back a laugh at how dry the next girl to enter his office was. She was probably sent because Delta was an idiot and would forget the message she would send back. "Tell them I'll meet them in 20 minutes, I have a few things to finish up," the redhead told the two girls, who simply nodded before leaving the office to deliver the message. "So, about the school I'm going to be enrolled in as your clear incentive for your acceptance of the teaching position, does it really have a high level? If not, can you get me private tutors?" The younger redhead asked her older brother, with her bright eyes giving her a much more lethal effect to the terrible puppy dog look. "We'll see, kid, we'll see," said the redhead with a smile as he messed up his younger sister's hair. "If I don't have the money, I can always have Natsum teach you, she has a master's degree in practically all magical subjects." Wendy had to roll her eyes. Natsum's damn technique was, in simple terms, one of the stupidest techniques ever, not because it was broken as such, but because it gave her omniscience. Alexandria simply gave her access to all knowledge of the present, past and future, and her naturally curious personality made her read more than half of those books and practice some of the skills in those books. "I suppose that's something I can accept," Wendy said with a smile before finally getting up from her older brother's lap. "Okay, then I'll have my things ready for the move before the week is over. We can go look for my school supplies," she said with a small smile. "We'll probably leave in 3 days, there are a few things I need to take care of before we go," the older brother told his younger sister, who simply nodded. "That's fine, it gives me time to enchant Byakko so he can change size at will," the younger redhead told her older brother, who simply blinked a couple of times. She was going to take a white tiger as a pet. Oh well, he was worse in that respect, so he couldn't say anything without sounding terribly hypocritical. Minus 20 minutes later, Naruto didn't take long to review all the things he had pending and soon gave the entrance to his fellow weapons and mentors to his office, who looked much more serious than he had seen them in a long time, which actually let him know that this meeting was not going to be one of his social visits. "Red, you have to go to Great Britain whether you want to or not," Suguru said with one of the worst timings possible. "Artoria has already deployed me as the resident sorcerer of Hogwarts, as well as the professor of Master of Magic, so you're a couple of hours late, my emo friend," Naruto said with his look making it clear that he found this situation incredibly funny, but to his surprise neither Satoru nor Suguru returned his smile. Quite the contrary, they remained impassive and simply sat in the 2 chairs in front of him and activated their office's privacy barriers to ensure that no one but the 3 of them could hear what they were going to discuss. "Very well, spill it, what's going on?" Naruto said, taking on his professional attitude. "We found 0.78% of a soul in Albania, belonging to Lord Voldemort," Satoru said with a serious expression. "But that would mean he was stupid enough to make 5 of those Horcruxes," Naruto said with his best shocked face. It was simply so incredibly stupid that he didn't even have words to describe it. At that moment Suguru simply took out a small vial containing 0.78% of Lord Voldemort's soul, before explaining the current situation of how they had gone to see Artoria to tell her about the situation and how they needed him to go to Hogwarts to recover the soul container so that Suguru could exorcise his soul and recover the artifacts that hopefully hadn't become cursed objects, although considering the dates given it was highly unlikely that they hadn't become completely cursed objects even without the influence of the corrupted soul. "We have locations of the other fragments of his soul?" the redhead asked with all the seriousness this matter required. "Vague ideas," Suguru said with the same seriousness. Without being able to move freely in Britain as they did in the rest of the world, they couldn't simply deploy a first-grade army to look for them, so they had resorted to this plan, sending the strongest, the only man that all human governments feared, to the point of letting him roam freely without any problem. Naruto simply closed his eyes for a few moments, which the 2 divine grades acting as his mentors understood as it was time to leave, as the strongest needed time to think about what he would do next. In the end he simply sighed. First of all, get an international transporter. Second, get a shipment of tranquilizers. He was clearly going to need them. 3 days later, currently Wendy was standing in her brother's courtyard looking at all the people he had decided to take on this trip. Of course she wasn't surprised at all to see Neapolitan. The girl was simply her brother's shadow. Wherever he went she followed, being both the greatest monsters that witchcraft had created in recorded history. Even if Neo was only a special grade, the 7 great shadows were something else that wasn't a surprise. They acted as his royal guard whenever they left this residence, which was more of a prison specially designed to keep the strongest man in the world calm and entertained to prevent him from killing them all. Not that Naruto would even if he wanted to, a world without people would be 1,000 times more boring, he had said so himself. Once all the checks were done, the group started walking towards the outside of the barriers to take the international transporter that Naruto had booked, and when they were far enough away so that his mother's informants couldn't hear them, Wendy broke the silence. "So, how are you going to solve this in the council?" she asked, wanting to know how Arturia had managed to allow her brother's deployment, as a master of all things. "No one will protect you better than me." Wendy had to agree, it was literally impossible to find a better guardian for her than her older brother, the guy who would literally kill God himself if it meant she would live one more day. It's no wonder the whole world officially recognized him as the most powerful sorcerer of all time. His lineage was truly, incredibly ancient, going back even beyond the era of the great emperor of the First Era, originating from the original Dragon King to act as guardians of the great enemy once the brothers blessed by the gods left the world, and after the fall of the Third Era, or rather, more of a "I don't care what happens to the world" from the king of that era, it was the Uzumakis who took control of the world, being naturally powerful, and specializing in runic witchcraft, and almost always having ridiculously broken curse techniques. They controlled the damn world economy by essentially having the Uruks under their control, not to mention their personal fortunes, which were said to be large enough to buy a small country. But speaking generally of her brother, he was simply the greatest genius the world had ever seen, even surpassing the expectations of everyone, no matter how high. His innate curse technique was possibly the most powerful ever recorded, being even more powerful than the king's throne, or the manifestation of emotions from the first and third kings of legend respectively, and he was versed in practically all subjects. He had never lost a fight in his life, not even against much more experienced combatants such as his uncle Gilgamesh 9, or Zeref 6. He had the highest count of curses and renegade sorcerers defeated. She didn't really understand how, or rather why people feared him so much. If he was powerful, it was undeniable, but he never laid a finger on the weak, or those who couldn't fight him. It was simply pointless for him to show his supremacy against people who wouldn't pose a challenge to him, even if they all fought together. Even so, she couldn't help but admire him for everything he had achieved at only 15 years old, and if she was being completely honest, she hoped to achieve at least a tenth of what her brother had achieved in his life. She didn't have much more time to think about that when they finally arrived at the location of their transporter, an old piece of rope. She shouldn't have been surprised, being such a large group, it was practically impossible not to use something that size, but she had hoped for something a little less rough. "Bad time to not have gloves," Wendy said, already planning a really long spa session to get rid of all the residue that rope would leave on her hands. "As if I were going to touch that," Naruto said before simply using some of his gravity control to levitate the piece of rope and then proceed to use his cursed ritual on it to turn it into something a little more elegant but without losing the spell that would take them to the British Isles, the new creation being a beautiful blood-red scarf which he extended to its full length so that each and every member of the group could hold it. Avalon. And with that said, the modified transporter activated, allowing the group to be dragged through spacetime until they crashed into the main hall of Camelot Castle. Well, almost everyone. Wendy fell onto her brother's chest, which helped cushion her fall, and Neo, being Neo, simply landed softly on the ground as if it were nothing. It really wasn't a big deal, it just affected semi-humans enormously in terms of internal hatred, and well, except for her, everyone here was semi-human. "Well, I'll leave them here to recover, I'll go find Artoria to let her know we've arrived." End of chapter. Book 1, Philosopher's Stone, Chapter 2, Bank of the Wizards. Wendy couldn't help but growl a little looking at what was in front of her at that moment, an old and dilapidated tavern that in her eyes was quite antiquated by several centuries. However, she didn't make any comment and simply entered after her older brother, not particularly worrying when the occupants didn't even look at them, allowing both siblings to walk calmly to the back where there was a small area with quite dilapidated bricks. Annie. Wendy really didn't like speaking English, but being in the United Kingdom, she had no choice but to do so, even if she didn't want to start with. "Tell me," asked the older Uzumaki, who had better command of the language than his sister, although honestly speaking, not by much. "Why do they hide the entrance? I mean, those without magic can't even see the bar," he asked, causing Naruto to actually stop for a few minutes to think about it. I simply don't know," Naruto said before simply shaking his head and using his fist to hit the pattern that Artoria had indicated to open the door to the magical British commercial alleyway, and when he did, a large brick arch quickly formed, making Wendy wince at all the people walking around, all of them wearing tunics. "I'm imposing the leggings," Wendy said, making Naruto and the two bodyguards they brought simply laugh a little at that comment. It was certainly a task they would support without hesitation. "First, we'll go to Gringotts to withdraw some money from Aunt Artoria's account to get our supplies," said the older Uzumaki, making it clear that his older cousin had allowed them direct access to her accounts. "Will she lend us money? Is that good or bad?" asked the redhead younger sister as she followed her older brother directly to the end of the alley. "Only if I don't get them to reactivate the Uzumaki vault," said the older redhead, immediately switching to Elvish so that Wendy understood that she shouldn't say his last name out loud. The younger Uzumaki simply nodded in understanding and continued walking to the entrance stairs of the bank where Naruto stopped to look at his younger sister. Make sure you're polite to the goblins. If we really want to access the money that mother doesn't control, then we have to make sure we don't offend them at all. Wendy simply nodded and entered with her sister. XXXX Griphook, one of those in charge of guarding the most important vaults of the bank, one of which was the enormous and valuable vault of Minato Namikaze, was the reason why he was currently running down the hall towards the VIP client room, as he had received a note telling him that the children of the most respected man by the Goblin Nation had entered and wished to make a withdrawal, so he had them moved to one of the best VIP rooms with some of the best amenities that the bank could offer them. If they were being stupid, he would make them regret uttering the man's name. Azkaban would seem like paradise compared to what he would do to them. He soon arrived at the room, panting and gasping for breath before looking through the crystal. He dismissed the beastkin and the girl with dual-colored hair. He didn't know them and they were possibly part of the royal guard of the children of the man. Instead, he focused his attention on the two redheads. He knew of course that Minato had children with the Uzumaki princess. He honestly never understood what he saw in her. As far as he knew, she was a horrible bitch with her son only for being born with infinite potential. In fact, this only made him sure that this was Minato Namikaze's son. Even from behind a magical crystal, he was able to feel the immense amount of cursed energy coming from the room. Curiously, it doesn't emanate from Naruto but from Wendy, who has 10 times the amount of cursed energy as her brother. Good morning, Griphook said as he entered the private room. I understand that the young Uzumaki prince wishes to reactivate his family's vaults? He asked as he looked at the older brother. He was 15 years old. That was true, however, according to goblin law. If you shed blood, you're old enough to be considered an adult. Vaults? Griphook couldn't help but grumble at the genuine confusion of the young man in front of him. His mother couldn't have denied him knowledge of his father's private fortune. That was a capital crime. Even the great kings couldn't simply ignore it. Do you have your key, young prince? Asked the goblin as he watched the older brother create the very elaborate crystal key from nothing, or rather, summon it from the pocket dimension that was rumored to be tied around his neck at all times. The key had many designs that appeared to be currents of wind, and the great Pendragon crest was right on top. Griphook of course knew that the key was real, but now the question was why Uzumaki? Namikaze's son would at least have the key to the Pendragon house. Even so, he simply took the key from the young man's hands and looked him directly in the eyes, almost as if he were asking for an explanation. He saw him move his lips without saying a single word, yet he could understand what he said without problem. If Lord Uzumaki is willing, I'd like to have a blood sample to confirm this. With all due respect, sir, but for that particular account we must be very careful, he said as he bowed slightly. He was Namikaze's son, there was no doubt, but was he really the great-grandson of those men? Namikaze never told them about his grandfather, who was said to be from that particular lineage. The same with Shanks, who was said to be the grandson of that particular woman. Naruto simply nodded before lightly cutting his thumb, allowing the blood in his body to begin to trickle out. He subsequently handed his hand over to Griphook, who used some goblin magic to take a single drop from the young man's hand and dropped it onto the ridge at the top of the key. And indeed the boy was the great-great-grandson of Eternary Pendragon. Not only was he the son of the most important man in current magical history, but he was actually related to the king of the past era directly, being legally speaking the true and legitimate ruler of magical Britain. Now Griphook simply bowed even lower, his voice almost whispering. Lord Uzumaki, thank you for coming here and we will proceed to your family vault. The two siblings simply got up and followed the goblin towards the carts that would take them to their vaults. The shadows didn't make a single sound. It was natural for Naruto and Slash or his younger sister to get what they wanted without any problem. Like their father before them, the two were respected simply for existing, and they were not affected in the least by this kind of thing. Soon the group arrived where the mine carts were kept. The goblin simply stopped before turning towards a wall with certain symbols and pressed a few of them with his long nails, then turned the one at the bottom. The cart that was waiting on the track started up just before a much nicer and more comfortable cart stopped in front of them. The cart was actually bright gold and had the Pendragon clan symbol on one of its sides. There was also a roof over it to prevent stones and water from falling on the occupants. Griphook opened the side door and stepped aside to let them in. This way, my lords, we will descend to your main vault. Naruto and his sister simply got into the cart and sat down in the cushioned and quite comfortable seats. The shadows simply sat on the opposite side of the cart once Naruto told them to do so. Griphook simply shrugged his shoulders, sat in front of the cart, and pulled one of the levers. The cart started moving and began to gain speed, getting faster and faster as they went. Humph, this cart is much better than those rusty cans they have in Switzerland, Wendy commented as she looked at her older brother, who had his eyes closed at that moment with a calm expression on his face. Why do they treat us like this? She wasn't used to being treated like the sun shone on her backside. In fact, people almost always treated them like outcasts, even if they were members of the royal family. In Great Britain, the Pendragon blood in our veins is worth more than all the Uzumaki blood. That wasn't the whole truth. He knew that the biggest reason why the goblins treated them with respect was because they didn't give a damn what their mother said. They respected their father, but not Kushina, who wasn't a warrior, unlike her father, who fought alongside the goblins in several wars. And they, as their children, deserved the same respect. Of course, the Pendragon blood in their veins also influenced it a little. They soon arrived at the vault with Wendy quite excited. The trip was almost like a roller coaster, one that had real wyverns instead of animatronic replicas. Vault 001, Pendragon Vault, Griphook announced as he got out of his seat to open the cart door. The vault door was made of stone, with the Pendragon clan symbol, the golden dragon. The goblin approached, caressing the door, revealing the lock where he inserted the key, and thanks to Naruto having deposited a drop of his blood in the eye of the same, it simply opened, and since this was the master key, all the vaults belonging to the young man behind him would also be reactivated. In other words, the Namikaze Vault, the English Uzumaki Vault, Elfrieden, among others, would be reactivated. He would have to ask the young prince to meet with the manager to ensure that they had a financial plan so as not to collapse the English economy, but rather the opposite. When the doors opened again, Naruto couldn't help but be amazed, as was Wendy. Both siblings simply stared at the enormous pile of gold coins that were actually as big as a two-story house and extended as far as their eyes could see, and considering that they were elves, it was a lot. How far does this go?" asked the redhead younger sister, wanting to know exactly how much money they had now. She was good with numbers, and although she could see that there were not only coins but also cups, jewels and other things, the coins were the majority. 2.41 kilometers deep, my lady," replied the goblin, making Naruto whistle in amazement, and according to the information that just reached his mind, this was only one of the vaults, specifically the king's own vault. Pendragon, his great-grandmother's vault, Milim's vault, among many others, were also under his control. "Do I have total control of this?" Naruto asked, remaining completely calm at that moment, his mind already thinking of 1,001 ways to use this wealth to gain his independence from his mother. "Your mother is not welcome in Gringotts, young prince. Anyone who has committed crimes against their family as she has will never be welcome within these walls, especially when those crimes were committed against the son of a great friend," the goblin told the young man, who simply had to nod. "I understand. I didn't want her to know anyway," Naruto said with a small smile. He would have to write to his cousin Neil to come to Great Britain as soon as possible. She was a much better economist than him, and her help to multiply his fortune would be quite welcome. "As you wish, sir," Griphook said, bowing deeply. Wendy was actually delighted with this. If they controlled this amount of gold, they wouldn't have to worry about depending on their mother's money. In fact, they might even be able to live freely in this place. With that thought, she looked at her older brother, noticing that he maintained a thoughtful expression. "Take the money you need to buy your supplies. This will probably take a while. I need to talk to an investment manager. This will last a while, but the idea that my children or yours will be left without anything eventually is one that I don't like, and I want to make it grow." Griphook actually smiled. He didn't have to suggest this to him anymore now that he had decided to do so on his own initiative. Soon his brother created a small bag to hold the coins needed for his sister's shopping trip, allowing her to fill it, chuckling when he noticed that his sister was actually putting money in her pockets in addition to the bag. "You don't wish to enter yourself, sir?" the goblin asked the older brother, who simply shook his head. He didn't really need this right now. What he needed was a direct transaction with the bank, a private residence with the best possible protections, and other things. Wendy soon left the vault sounding like a maraca because of the amount of gold she had loaded, which made Naruto actually think of a few ways to avoid this. The bags, even if they had protections to prevent them from being stolen, were quite cumbersome, and frankly, counting the coins one by one was incredibly annoying. "The name was Griphook, right?" the older Uzumaki asked the goblin as he looked through the window to see the being nod his head. "Do you know what a debit card is?" he asked, knowing that this would actually be a good way to better reactivate the English economy. His mother had refused to implement it worldwide, claiming that it wasn't necessary, even though all the other kings of the council agreed that it wasn't a bad idea and that it would help them go more unnoticed in the non-magical world. The goblin didn't actually respond with words, which made Naruto assume that they hadn't heard of this payment method, but if his expression was a sign of it, the goblin was actually interested. Naruto soon began to explain the operation of credit cards in a very basic way to the goblin, who started talking to the young man about some of the economic issues that Naruto knew, and of course, some of the ideas that Naruto had to improve the English and why not, the world economy as well, to the slight exasperation of his younger sister. Fortunately, they soon arrived back in the lobby where Griphook informed Naruto that an account manager would arrive at the private room where he had found them in a few minutes, something that made Wendy sigh definitively. This wasn't going to be a meeting of a few hours. In fact, it would probably be a meeting of several days. "It's going to be a long meeting, right?" asked the younger Uzumaki, making the older one ruffle her hair. "It's the first time I've had control of a significant amount of gold, sister, one that mother can't deprive us of to keep us under her control," Naruto said with a small and weak smile, making Wendy simply sigh again. "I understand all that, but I wanted to go shopping with you." Naruto simply gave her a small smile before bending down to look her in the eye. "Hey, we're siblings after all, right? Even if I have to be away from you, I'll always be there for you. I'll try to have the rest of the time free before the 1st of September. After that, you and I can look for a house together, our own house, free from her and her influence," said the older Uzumaki as he stood up before extending his fist to his younger sister. That sounds amazing, Annie, said the younger Uzumaki with a genuine smile as she bumped fists with her brother. Looking for a house, in her opinion, was a little better than a boring shopping trip. Naruto simply smiled back at his younger sister before turning towards the two silent shadows behind him, Zeta the catbeastkin, who had her sharp gaze watching every being that moved around her, making it clear that she would jump at the slightest perceived threat, which made it not a good idea to send her with her sister. Even if she wasn't as aggressive as Delta, she was much more lethal. Neo, take her to see the surroundings, and make sure everything goes well, Naruto said in his professional tone, earning a simple nod from the short girl with two colored hair who simply separated from her companion and positioned herself next to Wendy. Even if she preferred to be with Naruto, her sister was what he valued most, and well, she would protect her with her life. Wait, do you really think it's a good idea for Neo to show me around? Wendy on the other hand wasn't entirely sure that was a good idea. After all, Neo had extreme violent tendencies. You prefer Zeta, said her brother as he pointed to his other option. Neo is just sadistic, Zeta is brutal. I guess that makes sense, commented the redhead as she sighed slightly before turning to Neo. I'll see you when I'm free from my meeting, hopefully it won't be long, Naruto said, who was actually regretting not having accepted the infernal phone. Calling Neely with that would be much easier than having to write and send the letter by owl. End of chapter.